In Part D, discuss, with the support of calculations, the impact of the biscuit division's higher production on the fixed overhead allocation rate and value of inventory in terms of IAS 2. So let's just circle that "and" over there so that we make sure we answer both parts of the required. And please note, this is not just calculations or just discussion. We need to discuss with the support of calculations. So in terms of IAS 2, in periods where production is abnormally high, the amount of fixed overheads that are allocated to each unit of production needs to be decreased so that inventories are not measured above cost. Now, in this scenario, we are dealing with a situation where production was abnormally high. If you go back to the information provided in the scenario, they budgeted to produce 200,000 units. We calculated in Part B of the required. Go back to your calculations in Part B of the required. We calculated actual production. And you'll remember we calculated that they actually produced 300,000 units. So you can see actual production is significantly higher than budgeted production. And you should even perform a calculation over here because as per the required, you need to discuss with the support of calculations. So you should calculate how much actual production is higher than budgeted production. So I'll look at that calculation with you just now. For now, though, what I also want to draw your attention to is if we go back to the information provided in the scenario, over here, we were told that during the year, the CEO of Sweet Treats appeared on a popular reality TV cooking show, resulting in favorable publicity and a significant increase in sales volumes. As a result, actual production volumes were significantly higher than budgeted. All right, so that just once again confirms the fact that we know actual production is significantly higher than what they budgeted to produce. They budgeted to produce 200,000 units. They actually produced 300,000 units. Now, to support the discussion with a calculation, if we want to calculate how much it's higher by, obviously actual production is 100,000 units higher than budgeted production, but we want that as a percentage. And if we want that as a percentage, I'm just going to jump to my solution over here. You perform the calculation by taking your actual results, you deduct your budgeted results, and you divide by your budgeted results. So that's very similar to how we would usually calculate a movement. Remember, if we're calculating a movement from the prior year to the current year, we take the current year, we deduct the prior year, and we divide by the prior year. So you can see we are following exactly the same logic. They actually produced 300,000 units, they budgeted to produce 200,000 units, and we divide by what they budgeted to produce. So actual production was 50% higher than budgeted production. And we know in terms of IAS 2, in periods of abnormally high production, the amount of fixed overhead allocated to each unit of production is decreased so that inventories are not measured above cost. So guys, this is a very simple calculation. You'll remember over here when we calculated the fixed overhead allocation rate. Here's the calculation of our fixed overhead allocation rate. We took the budgeted fixed overhead and we divided by normal capacity, and that gave us an overhead allocation rate of 120 Rand per unit. So that's what we would have used to value inventory. Included in closing inventory at the end of the period is 120 Rand per unit for fixed overheads. However, because production is abnormally high, we need to make sure that inventory is not measured above cost. So all we do is we reperform this exact same calculation. However, instead of dividing by normal capacity or budgeted production, in this case because we didn't have normal capacity, all you're going to do is divide by actual production. So we recalculate this fixed overhead allocation rate by taking the budgeted fixed overhead and dividing by actual production of 300,000 units. And you can see that calculation over here. So that gives us an allocation rate of 80 Rand per unit. instead of 120 Rand per unit. So what's going to happen to the fixed overhead allocation rate? The fixed overhead allocation rate should decrease from 120 Rand per unit to 80 Rand per unit. But now make sure that you answer both parts of the required. We don't only need to discuss the impact on the fixed overhead allocation rate. We also need to discuss the impact on the value of inventory in terms of IAS 2. Now, you were specifically told that there were 5,000 completed units in closing inventory at the end of the period. So obviously when the division valued the closing inventory at the end of the period, they would have valued that closing inventory in terms of IAS 2. They would have included direct material, direct labor, variable overheads, and fixed overheads in the value of closing inventory. Now, when they performed that calculation, they would have included fixed overheads at a rate of 120 Rand per unit, because that's the fixed overhead allocation rate that we calculated. However, because production was abnormally high, we calculated that that rate needs to drop from 120 Rand to 80 Rand. So instead, the 5,000 units that are sitting in closing inventory at the end of the period, we should not be including 120 Rand per unit for fixed overheads. Instead, we should be including 80 Rand per unit for fixed overheads. That's the revised fixed overhead allocation rate that we just calculated. So that means we need to write down the value of inventory by 40 Rand, the difference between the 120 Rand, which is what it's currently valued at, and the 80 Rand, which is what it should be valued at. So the value of closing inventory at the end of the period should be written down by 200,000 Rand. How did I calculate that 200,000 Rand? It needs to be written down by 40 Rand. Included in closing inventory at the end of the period is fixed overheads at a rate of 120 Rand per unit. We recalculated the fixed overhead rate to be 80 Rand per unit. So that means the inventory is overvalued by 40 Rand per unit. So the 5,000 units sitting in closing inventory need to be written down at 40 Rand per unit. So the value of closing inventory should be written down by 200,000 Rand.